Welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cone, and I'm honored to serve as host for this podcast series. Today we have with us Bruno Camargo. He is a lawyer in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He helps organizations with resiliency, regeneration, and sustainability. Works with them on nature-based legal solutions, ESG, business, and human rights. He is an impact advisor, investor, and board member. And he is a partner, head of Latin America, ESG, and impact at Liance Legal. Liance Legal has offices in Amsterdam, Sao Paulo, and Curacao. Welcome, Bruno. We're so excited to have you here today.
Likewise, Pam. Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
So we're going to start with a big question. Tell me about your practice and tell me about your firm.
Sure. My firm is an Amsterdam-based law firm that was incorporated somewhat like 8 years ago by really practical, forward-looking, and hands-on lawyers. Mostly of them are Dutch qualified, but they also cover the majority of European countries. Liance is known by its clients for being a very hands-on and practical company and law firm advisor. So we try to defy the traditional way of delivering legal services by really making legal work for our clients. And I am currently based in São Paulo, Brazil, where I had the Latin America desk of Liance Legal. And I'm also spearheading the practice of ESG and impact, together with my other partners that also work in this realm. So we are joining forces in that aspect.
So tell me a little bit more about what an ESG practice looks like in Brazil. Like what are the hottest things you're working on with your clients now?
I think we are no different from a lot of places in the world. I mean, everybody working with ESG sort of scratching their heads and trying to find out where we land in terms of subjects that concern ESG. So the first thing to assess is that ESG is not a subject on itself, but it's a myriad of other subjects that could land differently in different clients. So you need to be really, specialized in the subjects that concern ESG, but also have the flexibility to understand what kind of subject would make sense to your client for your advice. It's not a one-size-fits-all. In Brazil, ESG translates a lot into securities regulation. So once you speak about ESG, a lot of people will connect with sustainability reports, securities regulation, but also on human rights. So this is a very prominent aspect of ESG that connects with human rights, because we are sitting in a very risky field. And of course, being Brazil, there's also a lot of work around carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and non-deforestation acts all over the world. So we use also the talent of Brazil and the natural resources as a field of connection with the subject.
So you touched just very briefly on regulations. How do the regulations in Brazil compare to, for instance, those that are coming out of the EU and the UK and presumably soon here in the US? Are you ahead of where everybody else is, or are you following what the UK and the EU are doing?
Well, I think we are pretty much aligned with what the European Union is enacting. We do have a regulation in Brazil coming in, which is the Resolution 193. And because of that, Brazil became a pioneer adopting the ISSB sustainability reporting standards. It will start voluntarily this year, but it will become mandatory by 2027. But it has some side effects. So the chosen path the companies will report will also impact the company in a way. So if they choose ISSB, they will have to sustain that path. The other path was double materiality, which is a known aspect in Europe. But in Brazil, with the adoption of ISSB, at least we have a very clear path, at least for the securities market in that aspect. And that is quite interesting. However, it will reinforce the shareholder culture to the detriment to the stakeholder culture.
Mm-hmm.
And in my personal opinion, we should be heading towards the stakeholder culture instead. But one regulation is better than non-regulation. That's my standpoint. So it helps also when you are advising the client in that aspect.
Tell me a little bit more about that. Why is it driving more towards shareholder culture and not necessarily towards a more inclusive stakeholder culture?
Well, being a regulation, it's hard to underpin culture.
Mm-hmm.
Because to measure culture and to deploy culture is less of a hard law regulatory principle and more of living by your pledge kind of work. So in a way, when you start regulating that in that realm, you lose, let's say, the more broad aspect of a stakeholder culture where, you know, opinions from your stakeholders and pressure groups and so on will play a role in what you report and how you behave as an organization. Whereas a regulation, it's more of, okay, we comply with those and we report like that. So the most subtle aspects of a stakeholder culture is not as present. And companies, the risk is that companies will feel they have done their job, but perhaps it could be a very timid or non-existent effort that you are just reporting right. And then, you know, you lose the more subtle aspect of the stakeholder culture, as you say, which you have to consider minority groups and voices that are not often heard or not often distributed in a purely check the box regulatory standard.
Mm-hmm. We're hearing or seeing, I should say, increased litigation, particularly here in the US, but also elsewhere around ESG topics. What are you seeing in Brazil on the litigation horizon with respect to ESG?
Yeah. So in Brazil, we have more than 70 cases of climate litigation going on. But the topic is still taboo in many circumstances. So those who litigate are seen as confrontational, radical troublemakers, and the person being litigated is a victim. Yeah. So the litigation should follow more a lawful aspect, a more technical aspect of litigation, rather than the traditional activism and confrontational behavior. And that will make a lot of changes going on, because right now, when you look to litigation as an activism, it requires a lot of confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
The good thing about Brazil, and also that applies to Latin America in many circumstances, is that the cause of litigation are often not a direct connection with a climate law. So, you know, you sue a company because they damaged the environment, but more of constitutional rights of people to have clean water, clean air, and also the rights of future generations. So, for instance, in Ecuador, we have a constitution that recognizes the existence and the rights of Mother Earth, which is called Pachamama in the traditional words of the peoples from the Andean countries. So if you disturb Pachamama, you are then infringing a constitutional right that Mother Earth has, like any other living being. And that's a fundamental difference, because you're not doing a quid pro quo lawsuit by a legal infringement, but more of a very broad concept of human rights, rights of future generations, rights of nature, and so on. And that requires a lengthy court proceeding, because first you need for the higher courts of justice to recognize that that constitutional right is being impacted. But then also created a very roomy ground for precedents, because once the higher courts adopt certain kinds of understandings, then you have a very deep connection with what you can ask in the lower courts. So in due course, that's going to become easier. But right now, we have really a lot of climate litigation, but it is still seen as more about activism, where we should treat it as a basic human right in due course.
And what about things like litigation around greenwashing, which is really a hot topic here in the US and also in the UK and Europe? Are you seeing any of that yet?
It's coming, but not with the same intensity. So we do have, it's more of a voluntary pledge of companies to not bring, false or misleading claims. However, it connects a lot with the securities and investment decisions. So once you have a fund or an investment product in which you advertise that it has certain sustainability aspects, and then you promote, and you trigger an investment decision based on that claim, maybe it's not greenwashing, but it's sort of a misleading claim. Bring the fiduciary duties of directors and board members into discussion by having accepting the terms and the terminology that could lead to an investment decision. So it's less from a consumer standpoint concerning greenwashing. That's still a bit loose in Brazil. You don't have a legislation like in Europe, where you are really pushing hard on that. So using green statements on products and so on. But we do have a very strong consumer law in Brazil. So I think it's a matter of time that the consumer associations will start paying attention to that for the consumer rights. But meanwhile, I think it's more of, the company being charged for their pledges that would sustain and would trigger an investment decision. So it requires a bit of elaboration in that field.
Yep. So if you were to predict what will be the hot emerging ESG topics, ESG related topics in 2024, both in Brazil and more broadly, what would be on that list?
Well, I have a lot of predictions. So I think one of the things that are really shining to me is that the agribusiness that has been portrayed as a villain of climate change is now becoming more a spearhead of change in perspective. So there are a lot of responsible examples within the agribusiness that are gain recognition for regenerative agriculture, a right use of land, right use of soil. So this field is becoming less of a villain and more of a protagonism point and role in terms of how this agenda is being pushed. So I think this is one fundamental change. Biodiversity credits is something that is in the market vocabulary now. We had later in the year the biodiversity COP in Colombia that will mark a very crucial moment in Brazil, in the region, I mean. And this is good because there's life beyond carbon. So a lot of the carbon credits, I call it a fallacy as well, because a lot of attention has been brought to that, and in the end, it doesn't work as expected. It's now becoming quicker a biodiversity credit. So I think is one trend. Polarization is also, we're not escaping from there. We have the two movements like you see elsewhere in the world. So I think it's going to get worse, the polarizing views of that. We just had a downturn for the CSRD in Europe that was going to be delayed by 2 years. And I credit that for the lobby the companies are doing for small and medium enterprises. We'll have the COP in Brazil in 2025. So it's already producing a lot of movements. Nobody wants to miss that one. So everybody that is in Brazil want to have a seat in the COP. I think, and one very important thing is that, pension funds are becoming more and more attentive to their ESG components. They're really making steps from asset holders to influence asset managers, and to look into that with a more consistent approach, not only getting the asset and never look into that, but making quite focused reviews. And finally, I have to say the climate deniers, it's game over. So it's there, it's undisputed. But in a way, the climate deniers won because climate change is here. We have irreversible impacts. So it doesn't really matter if you're a denier or not, because in the end you won. The climate change is there. So I think we need to do more visible and palpable measures there.
So I know you just mentioned that COP 2025 is going to be in Brazil. If we were to talk a year from now, what will we be talking about?
Well, 1 year from now,
I guess COP won't have happened yet, right? Not COP
no,
2025.
exactly. It's for next year. So I think, well, we have COP this year yet. So we have, it's
Yes.
going to be Azerbaijan. The last COP was quite disappointing for many reasons, but you cannot expect anything else from that meeting. And COP 20 in this year is going to be a bit more of the same. And I think next year is the first time that we're going to have a gathering in the Amazon, promoted by a country that holds a significant amount of the biodiversity in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I expect that we are going to talk more about transition, about renewable energies. One should not forget that Brazil has the current energy matrix that Germany wants to have by 2050. So we do have, the majority of our energy matrix is made by clean resources. It's water, it's hydroelectrics, although we have downturns and side effects of that, but still is a non-polluting kind of energy production. So I think transition for finance is something that we are going to hear more and more, because this was the answer, the question unanswered in COP last year. How do we move away from fossil fuels? And then a play of words was there saying, well, we will do attempts to slowly reduce. So really a lot of care in choosing the words in the results. And I think this is not going to last for long. We will need to face that issue and face, transition as a solution. And when I mention transition, I mention a fair transition where you consult and consider the rights of the people that are involved in that.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier sort of the polarization and the climate deniers and all the work that's ahead of us. Given all of that, what gives you hope? Why do we keep working in this space? There's got to be some hope there somewhere. So what is the hope for you?
I've been dealing to unsolved problems for many years. I've seen how since the late 90s, how the regulations and enforcement against money laundering happened. I remember very vividly when I started working with anti-corruption 20 years ago, that you start training people and talking about corruption prevention. They said, well, that's never going to change. Although I'm not a big supporter of enforcement when it comes to corruption, I think we should tackle more fundamental issues such as human rights and states' vulnerability. But still, some years ago, you would say, well, corruption is nothing that we can do about. The same for privacy, the same for consumer rights, and so on. So what gives me hope is that a significant number of people are getting more and more aware of that. And within that group, a even more significant group of people are younger generations. So they are looking to that as something that shouldn't be even disputed or shouldn't even be a subject. So it's just common sense to them. And you don't need a majority of adopters to make a change in any system. You actually need a very small amount of people. Studies say that around 3% of people that adopt a certain behavior will make a system change. So there's a lot of discussion about breaking the bubble. So we are speaking to the converted, and we should burst the bubble and speak to the outside world. But I think that's an unavoidable consequence. If you have a very strong bubble, and that bubble is really making its statement hard and are following the path and walking the talk, it's really something that we will see a change. Maybe it's not the change that we are portraying right now. Maybe the change will come in different ways. But I think that the most efficient way of applying that is on governance, and tackling governance in the companies, because that's the future-proof aspect. If you change a CEO, if you change an executive management, if you change board members, if you have a strong governance based on stewardship, on land rights, on nature rights, then you are future-proof. And that gives me hope that we assess this right now and start implementing rights of natures at the board, for instance.
I love what you said about a small group of people making a change. There's a famous Margaret Mead quote. She says something like, I might get this wrong, but she said, never underestimate the power of a small group of people to make change. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So that's to your point, that it only takes 3% to cause a system to change. And I think we're getting to that tipping point, obviously, in large part because of a lot of the work that's being done, but in large part because the younger generation just isn't even questioning that that's the way it should be. It's the new norm, let's hope.
Is the new norm. And a lot of people sometimes get disappointed because they don't see a big movement. They see a lot of detractors. And it's not about being naive or be wearing rosy lenses to watch this movement, but really believing that, you can't change 20% of the world. You can't change the environment that you are sitting in, the small groups, your small community. So it's about of reducing, degrowing, thinking on smaller systems, smaller businesses, smaller communities, because those are the ones that thrive. I love that book, Small is Beautiful, by E.F. Schumacher. It's a fundamental book for anyone willing to understand sustainability from a systems change perspective. And in that book, Schumacher says, that smaller communities are those that thrive. And I see that growing in small capsules that in a way interconnect themselves. And I was really, really happy that last year that the degrowth event happened in the European Parliament, where there were a significant number of people who went to discuss how do we grow less? How do we do negative growth? We don't need more billionaires. We don't need more super large conglomerates. We need lesser of that accumulation and more distribution. We don't have a food problem in the world. We have a distribution problem in the world. So all these concepts need to be put at the conversation table. And in the end, all of them make a lot of sense from a systems change standpoint and the sustainability efforts.
Well, I hope that when we talk a year from now, we will have seen lots of progress in all of these areas. Thank you so much for the work you're doing, and thank you so much for being part of our podcast series today.
It's truly my pleasure, Pam. We are going to keep in touch.
Absolutely.
And I wish you all the best.
Okay, likewise. Thank you.